In 1944, Japanese soldiers started dying in ways they couldn't explain. Shells were exploding perfectly above their heads with impossible accuracy. No timer could do this. No gunner was that good. And the Americans weren't talking. What the Japanese military didn't know was that America had just deployed the most secret weapon of World War II, more classified than the atomic bomb during most of the war. A tiny device that could think, calculate, and kill with precision that seemed like magic. This is the story of the proximity fuse, and how a small radio inside an artillery shell changed warfare forever and turned the Pacific theater into a nightmare for Japanese forces. Let's go back to 1940. Britain is getting hammered. German bombers are flying over London every single night, dropping thousands of tons of explosives on civilian neighborhoods. The British are firing back with everything they have. Anti-aircraft guns are blazing away, filling the sky with shells and shrapnel. But here's the problem. They're barely hitting anything. Think about what these gunners are dealing with. A bomber is flying at 300 miles per hour, maybe 15,000 feet up in the air. It's dark, it's moving. You have to aim where you think it's going to be, not where it is right now. Then you have to set the fuse on your shell to explode at exactly the right altitude. If you set it for 14,000 feet and the plane is at 16,000 feet, your shell explodes too early and does nothing. If you set it for 16,000 feet and the plane is at 14,000, same problem. Completely useless explosion in empty air. The numbers were brutal. British gunners were firing thousands of shells to bring down a single aircraft. Sometimes tens of thousands. During the entire London Blitz, it took an average of 20,000 shells to destroy one German plane, 20,000 each. Shell cost money to make, required workers to produce, needed to be transported to the gun sites, and had to be loaded and fired by exhausted crews working through the night. All that effort, all those resources, for one plane. And it wasn't just about the waste. Every shell that didn't hit a bomber meant that bomber kept flying, kept dropping its payload, kept killing civilians on the ground. British scientists and military leaders knew they needed something better. They needed shells that could figure out on their own when to explode. They needed shells that could hunt. The Americans were watching all of this very carefully. They knew that if they entered the war, they'd face the same problem, maybe worse. Japanese planes in the Pacific were fast and maneuverable. Zero fighters could dance around anti-aircraft fire like it wasn't even there. If the US Navy couldn't protect its ships from air attack, the entire Pacific campaign would be impossible. Aircraft carriers, battleships, destroyers, transport ships carrying supplies and troops, all of them would be sitting ducks. So, in 1940, before America even officially entered the war, a small group of scientists started working on something that had never been done before. They wanted to put a radio inside an artillery shell. Not just any radio. This radio would have to survive being fired out of a gun at forces that would flatten a normal human being. It would have to work while spinning at hundreds of rotations per second. It would have to be cheap enough to mass produce. And it would have to be smart enough to detect when it was near an aircraft and detonate at exactly the right moment. The man leading this project was named Merle Tuve. He worked at something called the Department of Terrestrial Magnetism, which sounds like the most boring name for a research lab ever created. But that was kind of the point. Nobody would suspect that earth-shattering weapons research was happening at a place that studied magnetic fields. Tuve pulled together a team of physicists, engineers, and radio experts. They set up shop at Johns Hopkins University in Maryland and got to work. The first problem was the most basic one. How do you make a radio small enough to fit in a 5-inch artillery shell? Remember, this is 1940. Computers don't exist yet. Transistors haven't been invented. All radios use vacuum tubes, and vacuum tubes are fragile glass containers full of delicate filaments. If you've ever seen an old radio from this era, you know how big they are. The idea of putting one of these inside a shell that would experience 20,000 times the force of gravity when fired seemed completely insane. But Tuve's team started experimenting. They tried different types of vacuum tubes. They tried different ways of mounting them. They built special testing machines that could simulate the incredible forces of being fired from a gun. Tubes shattered. Circuits failed. Prototypes exploded. But slowly, gradually, they started making progress. They developed a special miniature vacuum tube that was much tougher than anything that existed before. They figured out how to pot the entire radio circuit in a special compound that would absorb shock. They designed a battery that could deliver power in the split second after firing, before the forces tore everything apart. Every single component had to be reinvented from scratch. The radio itself worked on a beautifully simple principle. The fuse would send out radio waves in all directions. If those waves hit something metal, like an aircraft, they'd bounce back. The fuse would detect the returning signal and calculate how far away the object was. When the distance was right, boom. The shell would detonate, sending shrapnel in all directions from a point in space right next to the target. You didn't have to hit the plane directly. You just had to get close. By 1941, they had working prototypes. The team loaded them into shells and started testing. Early results were mixed. Sometimes the fuses worked perfectly. Sometimes they didn't work at all. Sometimes they detonated at the wrong moment. There were embarrassing failures where shells exploded immediately after firing, right over the guns. Not great when you're trying to sell the military on your new superweapon. But the team kept refining the design. They improved the radio sensitivity. They made the circuits more reliable. They figured out how to filter out interference. And most importantly, they made the whole thing mass-producible. Because here's the thing about artillery shells. You don't need 10 of them. You don't need 100. You need millions. The fuse had to be simple enough that regular factory workers could assemble them on production lines, churning out thousands per day. By 1942, the design was ready. The military gave it a code name, VT Fuse. The official story was that VT stood for variable time, suggesting it was just an improved mechanical timer. The real meaning was vacuum tube, but that was classified. The entire project was wrapped in the highest levels of secrecy. Workers in the factories that built the fuses didn't know what they were making. They just assembled components according to specifications. The components were manufactured in different facilities, so no single factory had the complete design. Security was so tight that even most military officers didn't know the fuses existed. Production ramped up fast. By 1943, American factories were producing hundreds of thousands of VT fuses every month. They were being loaded into anti-aircraft shells for the Navy, into artillery shells for the Army, into everything that exploded in the air. But there was one absolute rule that couldn't be broken under any circumstances. These fuses could never, ever be used over land where the enemy might recover one. See, the military knew that if a VT fuse fell into enemy hands, they could figure out how it worked. And once they understood the principle, they could make their own. Or worse, they could develop countermeasures. So the fuses were only used at sea, where any dud shells would sink to the bottom of the ocean, far beyond enemy reach. The Navy started using them in 1943, and the results were immediate and dramatic. Japanese aircraft attacking American ships started getting shredded out of the sky. Kamikaze pilots, who expected to get through anti-aircraft fire, suddenly found themselves flying into walls of perfectly timed explosions. Gun crews, who used to fire hundreds of shells per aircraft, were now bringing down planes with just a few rounds. Ships that would have been sunk were staying afloat. Lives were being saved. But the Army wanted in on this too. They looked at the VT fuse and saw something the Navy hadn't fully explored. What if you used these in regular artillery against ground targets? Think about it. Traditional artillery shells hit the ground and explode, which is fine if your target is in a building or behind a wall. But if your target is enemy soldiers spread out in the open, a lot of the explosive force gets absorbed by the ground. It's inefficient. But with a VT fuse, you could make the shell explode 20 or 30 feet in the air, right over the enemy's heads. The shrapnel would spray down in a cone, covering a much larger area. Soldiers who might have survived by hitting the dirt would be exposed. Trenches wouldn't protect them. Foxholes wouldn't protect them. It would be like artillery on steroids. The problem was that rule. No VT fuses over land where they could be recovered. The military stuck to this policy through 1943 and most of 1944, even as the land war in Europe and the Pacific heated up. But then came December 1944, and everything changed. The Germans launched their last major offensive of the war. The Battle of the Bulge. They hit American lines in Belgium with everything they had, pushing through the Ardennes forest in the middle of winter. American forces were getting surrounded, cut off, overwhelmed. The situation was desperate. Commanders on the ground were screaming for anything that could help stop the German advance. General Eisenhower made a decision. He authorized the use of VT fuses in land combat. The risk of the Germans recovering a dud was real. But the Americans figured that by this point in the war, even if Germany got their hands on one, they wouldn't have time to develop their own version before the war ended. The gamble was worth it. American artillery battalions loaded up VT fuses and started firing them at German positions. The effect was devastating. German soldiers who had spent years learning how to survive artillery barrages suddenly found that none of their training mattered. The shells weren't hitting the ground anymore. They were exploding overhead with perfect timing, turning entire areas into kill zones. The German offensive stalled. The Battle of the Bulge was eventually won by the Allies, and VT fuses played a significant role. But here's where our story really gets interesting. After the Battle of the Bulge, the secret was out. VT fuses had been used on land. The absolute ban was lifted. And military planners in the Pacific started thinking very carefully about what this meant for the war against Japan. By early 1945, American forces were closing in on the Japanese home islands. But every step forward was costing thousands of lives. The Japanese weren't surrendering. They were fighting for every inch of ground with a ferocity that shocked even veteran American troops. Iwo Jima, Okinawa. These weren't battles, they were slaughterhouses. Japanese defensive doctrine relied heavily on positions that were incredibly difficult to destroy. Bunkers carved into volcanic rock. Cave systems that went on for miles. Interconnected tunnels where soldiers could pop up, fire, and disappear before artillery could target them. American commanders knew that if they had to invade the Japanese mainland, the casualties would be unthinkable. Some estimates suggested 1 million American dead and wounded. Artillery was already the king of the battlefield in World War II. More casualties were caused by artillery than any other weapon. But traditional artillery had limitations against dug-in defenders. If soldiers were in deep bunkers or caves, you had to score a direct hit to kill them, and direct hits were rare. Most shells exploded nearby and did little damage to protected troops. VT fuses changed that calculation completely. Now artillery didn't need direct hits, it just needed to get close. And American artillery crews were very good at getting close. In April 1945, during the battle for Okinawa, the Army started using VT fuses in their artillery shells. Not just anti-aircraft rounds. Regular high-explosive shells meant for ground targets. They were firing them at Japanese positions across the island. And the results were unlike anything seen before in the Pacific War. Japanese soldiers started reporting something terrifying happening. Shells were exploding in the air, above their positions with uncanny precision. Not at random heights like some kind of timer. At the exact altitude that would cause maximum casualties, 20 feet up, 30 feet up. Whatever height would spray shrapnel down most effectively on their specific position. It seemed impossible. It seemed like the Americans had developed some kind of supernatural aiming ability. Bunkers that would protect soldiers from ground bursts became death traps when shells burst overhead. The shrapnel would come down through ventilation holes, through doorways, through any opening. Trenches became killing zones. Even soldiers hiding in shell craters found no safety because the blasts were coming from above. The Japanese military tried to figure out what was happening. They collected shell fragments. They examined dud rounds that failed to detonate. They interrogated prisoners. They analyzed attack patterns. But they couldn't understand the mechanism. Some Japanese officers theorized that the Americans must have spotters with perfect observation positions, who were somehow communicating the exact altitude of every shell in flight. Others thought it might be some kind of new ballistic calculation method that was impossibly accurate. The idea that each individual shell was making its own decision about when to detonate based on reflected radio waves was so far beyond their technical capabilities that they couldn't even conceive of it. Here's where the 20,000 G part of our story comes in. G-force is a measurement of acceleration. 1 G is what you feel just sitting still on Earth, the pull of gravity. When a fighter pilot makes a hard turn, they might experience 8 or 9 Gs. Enough to make them pass out if they're not trained for it. When you fire an artillery shell out of a gun, the forces are incomprehensible to human biology. Depending on the gun, an artillery shell can experience anywhere from 10,000 to 30,000 Gs. To put that in perspective, if you experienced 20,000 Gs, even for a fraction of a second, every bone in your body would shatter into powder. Your internal organs would become paste. Your blood would separate into components, like in a centrifuge. Nothing alive can survive forces like that. And yet, the VT Fuze had to survive it. That tiny radio, with its vacuum tubes and circuits and battery, had to go from 0 to 1,500 miles per hour in the length of a gun barrel, spinning like a top the entire time, and then it had to work perfectly for the few seconds it had before reaching its target. The fact that anyone figured out how to build something that could do this is genuinely remarkable. Each fuse was a small miracle of engineering, and the Americans were producing them by the millions. As the battle for Okinawa continued, American artillery battalions kept firing shells equipped with VT fuses. The numbers are hard to verify exactly, but conservative estimates suggest that over 200,000 VT-fused shells were fired during the Okinawa campaign alone. Each one was like a smart weapon, making its own decision about the optimal detonation point. Collectively, they turned Japanese defensive positions into meat grinders. Japanese casualties from artillery increased dramatically compared to earlier battles. Medical officers reported that the nature of wounds was changing. More head wounds, more wounds to the back and shoulders, showing that shrapnel was coming from above. More cases of multiple casualties in what should have been protected positions. The psychological effect was almost as devastating as the physical casualties. Japanese soldiers knew they couldn't hide from this. There was no safe position. Anywhere American artillery could reach became a potential death zone. But the Americans weren't just using VT fuses in standard artillery, they were getting creative. They loaded them into naval guns for shore bombardment, turning battleships and cruisers into platforms for precision indirect fire. They used them in howitzers for plunging fire that would burst over reverse slopes where Japanese troops thought they were safe. They even experimented with using them in anti-personnel roles during nighttime defensive positions, creating protective barriers of precisely timed airbursts that would shred any Japanese soldiers attempting infiltration tactics. The Japanese weren't the only ones who didn't see this coming. The Germans had actually been working on their own proximity fuse design, but their program was nowhere near as advanced as the American effort. When German scientists eventually examined captured VT fuses after the Battle of the Bulge, they were stunned by the sophistication of the design, the miniaturization, the ruggedness, the reliability. They realized that the Americans had made breakthroughs in multiple fields simultaneously. Radio, technology, manufacturing, quality control. The VT fuse wasn't just one invention. It was dozens of inventions working together. After the war, military analysts tried to calculate exactly how much difference the VT fuse made. The numbers are staggering. In anti-aircraft roles, VT fuses increased kill rates by a factor of 5. That means one shell with a VT fuse was as effective as 5 shells with traditional fuses. For ground targets, the increase was even more dramatic in some situations. Artillery batteries that would have needed to fire hundreds of shells to clear an area could now do it with dozens. The fuse was also credited with saving countless American lives. Ships that would have been sunk by kamikaze attacks stayed afloat because the kamikazes were shot down before reaching their targets. Ground troops who would have been killed by enemy fire survived because artillery support was suddenly much more effective. Some estimates suggest that VT fuses may have saved tens of thousands of American lives during the final year of the war. But there's a darker side to this story too. The VT fuse made killing more efficient. That's what it was designed to do. And efficiency in killing means more people die faster. Japanese soldiers and civilians in combat zones died in larger numbers because of this technology. The ethical questions about weapons development don't have easy answers, and the VT fuse is a perfect example of why. From a pure technology standpoint, though, the VT fuse represented a massive leap forward. It was one of the first practical autonomous weapons. The fuse could sense its environment and make decisions based on that sensory input without human intervention. This was happening in 1943, decades before personal computers or microprocessors existed. In many ways, the VT fuse was a preview of what modern smart weapons would eventually become. One of the most interesting aspects of the VT fuse story is just how well the secret was kept. The Manhattan Project, which developed the atomic bomb, is famous for its secrecy. But for most of the war, the VT fuse program was actually more classified. The reason was simple. If the Germans or Japanese captured an atomic bomb before it was used, there wasn't much they could do with it. The physics were too complicated, the materials too rare, the manufacturing too difficult. But if they captured a VT fuse and figured out how it worked, they could potentially develop their own version and use it against Allied forces. So while the atomic bomb project had thousands of people working in massive facilities in Los Alamos and Oak Ridge, creating a security nightmare, the VT fuse program was much more distributed and compartmentalized. The workers building the fuses didn't know what they were making. The officers ordering them didn't know how they worked. Even the artillery crews firing them were told as little as possible. The code name VT was deliberately misleading. When officers asked what it stood for, they were told veritable time and given technical explanations about improved mechanical timing mechanisms. The truth was hidden in plain sight. The fuses themselves looked relatively ordinary from the outside, just a metal cylinder that screwed into the nose of a shell. Nothing obviously high-tech about the exterior. All the magic was happening inside, hidden from view. There were some close calls. Several VT-fused shells failed to detonate during combat and landed intact in enemy territory. Each time this happened, there was panic among American intelligence officers. Had the enemy recovered it? Did they figure it out? But somehow, through luck or through the chaos of combat, the shells either weren't found or weren't recognized for what they were. The secret held. It wasn't until after the war ended that the full story of the VT fuse started to become public. Even then, many details remained classified for years. The complete technical specifications weren't declassified until the 1950s. By that point, the technology had already evolved into more sophisticated systems, but the basic principle remained the same. The VT fuse changed how military planners thought about artillery. Before, artillery was kind of a blunt instrument. You fired a lot of shells at a general area and hoped that some of them landed close enough to the target to do damage. After the VT fuse, artillery became a precision weapon. You could engage point targets with high confidence of success. You could provide close air support without worrying as much about hitting friendly forces. You could create defensive barriers of airbursts that were incredibly effective at stopping enemy advances. Modern artillery still uses descendants of the VT fuse concept. Today, we call them proximity fuses, and they use more sophisticated sensors like radar or laser rangefinders instead of simple radio waves. But the core idea is the same. The shell senses when it's near the target and detonates at the optimal moment for maximum effect. This concept has been adapted for all kinds of weapons: air-to-air missiles, anti-tank rounds, even rifle grenades. The VT fuse pioneered the idea of smart ammunition, and that idea has only become more important as time goes on. There's also a direct line from the VT fuse to modern guided munitions. The GPS-guided artillery shells that the military uses today are basically VT fuses taken to their logical extreme. Instead of just sensing when they're near a target, they can actively steer themselves to hit a specific point. But they're using the same basic principle. Sensors on the weapon. Autonomous decision-making. Detonation at the optimal moment. Despite its massive impact, the VT Fuze isn't very well known outside of military history circles. Most people have heard of the atomic bomb, radar, and code breaking as decisive technologies of World War II. But the VT Fuze, which was actually used in combat much more extensively than the atomic bomb, and arguably saved more lives than it ended, is relatively obscure. Part of the reason is that it wasn't dramatic in the way that other weapons were. The atomic bomb had a single moment of terrible clarity. You could point to Hiroshima and Nagasaki and understand exactly what had happened. Radar had clear, visible effects on the outcome of battles like Britain's victory in the Battle of Britain. Code-breaking had stories of brilliant mathematicians solving impossible puzzles. The VT Fuze was different. Its effects were cumulative and statistical. Each individual VT fused shell didn't look that different from a regular shell. The explosion was the same. The sound was the same. The difference was in the targeting, in the efficiency, in the kill rate. Those are things you understand when you look at spreadsheets and after-action reports. Not when you're watching footage of a battle. It's not cinematic. It's not dramatic. It's just brutally, mathematically effective. But for the Japanese soldiers who faced it in 1945, the VT Fuze was a nightmare made real. An invisible enemy that turned the sky itself into a weapon. Shells that seemed to know exactly where they were and exactly when to explode to kill them. Artillery that could reach into bunkers and caves and trenches and kill with precision that seemed impossible. The Japanese military tried everything they could think of to counter it. They dug deeper bunkers, but the airbursts would still get them when they moved between positions. They spread out more, but that just made them less effective as a fighting force. They tried to shoot down the shells in flight, which obviously didn't work. They tried to jam the radio signals, but they didn't understand the frequency bands being used, and their jamming attempts had no effect. Nothing worked. The only defense was to not be where American artillery could reach, and by 1945, there weren't many places like that left. Calculating exactly how many Japanese soldiers were killed by VT-fused artillery is impossible. Combat is chaotic, and record-keeping breaks down. Many casualties from artillery weren't specifically identified as coming from proximity-fused shells versus regular shells. But we can make some educated guesses based on artillery expenditure rates and casualty reports. During the Okinawa campaign, American forces fired over 2 million artillery shells. If even 10% of those were VT-fused, that's 200,000 shells. If each VT-fused shell was 5 times more effective than a regular shell, as the anti-aircraft data suggested, then those 200,000 shells did the work of 1 million regular shells. The Japanese suffered over 100,000 combat deaths during Okinawa, and a significant percentage of those were from artillery. The VT Fuze's contribution to that toll was substantial. But beyond the raw numbers, there's the strategic impact. The VT Fuze made the prospect of invading the Japanese home islands much less costly for American forces. It meant that the artillery support for the invasion would be devastatingly effective. It meant that Japanese defensive positions that would have taken days or weeks to reduce could potentially be neutralized in hours. That changed the entire calculation of what the invasion would look like. Of course, the invasion never happened. The atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki led to Japan's surrender in August 1945. But in the planning stages before those bombs were dropped, the availability of VT fuses was factored into every invasion plan. Commanders knew they had a weapon that would give them a significant advantage, and that knowledge influenced their strategic thinking. Today, proximity fuses are standard equipment in militaries around the world. The technology has been refined and improved over decades. But the basic concept that Merle Tuve's team developed in 1940 remains unchanged. Sense the target. Calculate the distance. Detonate at the optimal moment. It's simple, elegant, and deadly effective. The VT fuse also represented a turning point in how weapons were developed. Before World War II, weapons development was mostly an incremental process. You made guns that were a little better than the last generation of guns. You made tanks that were a little more armored, or a little faster. The VT Fuze was different. It represented a quantum leap in capability. It did something that was fundamentally impossible before. That approach to weapons development, looking for game-changing breakthroughs rather than incremental improvements, became the standard in the post-war era. The scientists and engineers who worked on the VT Fuze went on to contribute to many other projects. Some worked on radar systems. Some helped develop early computers. Some went into the aerospace industry and helped put men on the moon. The skills they developed in miniaturization, in making electronics that could survive extreme conditions, in mass production of complex systems, all of those skills transferred to other fields and helped drive technological progress for decades. And somewhere in the Pacific Ocean, at the bottom of the sea, near Okinawa and Iwo Jima, and dozens of other battle sites, there are still unexploded VT fused shells lying in the sand and coral, rusting, forgotten. Silent witnesses to one of the most effective weapons ever deployed in combat. A weapon so secret that the enemy never figured out how it worked. A weapon so effective that it changed the course of battles and saved thousands of lives. A weapon that turned American artillery into a precision instrument of war, and Japanese defensive positions into meat grinders. The proximity fuse wasn't the most famous weapon of World War II. It wasn't the most powerful. It wasn't the most terrifying. But in terms of pure effectiveness, in terms of the ratio between its cost and its impact, it might have been the single best weapon innovation of the entire war. And the Japanese never saw it coming. So, that's the story of how 20,000 G-rated fuses turned American artillery into something the Japanese military couldn't counter. A tiny radio, a breakthrough in miniaturization, a secret so well kept that even today, most people have never heard of it. The VT Fuze killed efficiently, changed warfare permanently, and saved lives by ending battles faster. It's a reminder that sometimes the most important innovations aren't the ones that make headlines. Sometimes they're the quiet breakthroughs that only specialists understand, but that change everything. Check out the next video to see what happened when this technology evolved into modern smart weapons.